Robert's accountant asked him a simple question during their annual meeting: how much of his income he'd spent last year versus saved. And Robert genuinely didn't know the answer. Not because he was careless, but because for someone earning what he earned, the question had never seemed necessary to track precisely. His accountant pulled up the actual numbers instead. Robert had saved 62% of his income that year, a figure he hadn't consciously aimed for and had never once calculated himself. It wasn't a strategy he designed. It was a structure he'd built years earlier, and the structure had simply kept running on its own. My name is Emory, and if you've ever assumed that managing money like the wealthiest people requires access to exclusive investments, insider information, or an income most people will never reach, then this video should help explain why that assumption misses the actual mechanism. And if that's useful to you, sticking around and subscribing helps this channel keep breaking down financial patterns that get mistaken for privilege when they're really just structure. Most people think the 1% manages money differently because they have access to opportunities ordinary people don't. They're completely wrong, or at least, that's a much smaller part of the story than commonly assumed, because research into how high-net-worth households actually behave financially reveals patterns built on structural habits available to almost anyone, not on exclusive access unavailable to the rest of the population. The first pattern worth examining is the one Robert stumbled into without naming it directly: treating savings as a fixed obligation rather than a leftover. Most financial advice frames savings as whatever remains after spending, a residual number that fluctuates based on how disciplined someone feels in a given month. High-net-worth households tend to invert this relationship entirely, treating a specific savings rate as a fixed, non-negotiable line item, with spending adjusting to fit whatever remains afterward. This isn't a subtle distinction. It fundamentally changes which variable in the equation gets to be flexible, and flexible spending, rather than flexible saving, produces dramatically different long-term outcomes even at identical income levels. Here's where this gets genuinely interesting, because this single structural inversion connects directly to a well-documented behavioral pattern. Decisions made once and then automated hold steady far more reliably than decisions requiring willpower every single time they are made. A savings rate treated as fixed and automated removes the monthly negotiation entirely. There's no month where motivation determines whether saving happens, because the structure has already made that decision in advance. This is precisely the mechanism separating Robert's 62% savings rate from someone earning the same income who saves inconsistently based on how each month happens to feel. The second pattern involves how debt gets treated, and it diverges sharply from common assumptions about wealthy households avoiding debt entirely. High-net-worth individuals frequently use debt strategically, but with a specific, consistent distinction. Debt used to acquire appreciating assets or to fund income-generating activity gets treated very differently than debt used to fund consumption. A mortgage on a property, a loan to expand a business, financing used to purchase investment assets. These represent debt working alongside wealth accumulation. Credit card balances carried to fund lifestyle spending represent the opposite, debt actively working against it. The distinction isn't about avoiding debt on principle. It's about a consistent filter applied to every borrowing decision. Does this debt build toward something that grows, or does it simply defer a cost with interest attached? Someone might reasonably ask why this filter matters so much, since debt is debt regardless of its stated purpose. It's a fair question, and the honest answer lies in what each type of debt does to a household's overall trajectory. Interest paid on consumption debt is money permanently removed from the system, with nothing gained in return beyond the original purchase. Interest paid on debt tied to an appreciating or income-generating asset is a cost incurred specifically because the underlying asset is expected to produce a return exceeding that cost, meaning the debt itself becomes part of a wealth-building mechanism rather than a drain on one. This distinction, applied consistently rather than occasionally, is a structural habit rather than a one-time decision, which is precisely why it compounds into a meaningfully different financial trajectory over enough time. The third pattern is diversification treated as a discipline rather than a single decision made once. Wealthy households don't simply diversify their investment portfolio and consider the job finished. They maintain diversification across several distinct dimensions simultaneously, across asset classes, stocks, real estate, and business ownership. Across time horizons, some capital deployed for immediate liquidity and some locked away for decades, and critically across income sources themselves, rather than depending entirely on a single paycheck or a single business. This layered diversification means a downturn in any single area, a market decline, a business slowdown, a job loss, doesn't threaten the entire financial structure at once, because no single source was ever carrying the full weight of the household's financial stability. Someone might reasonably ask how someone earning a single, ordinary salary could realistically diversify income sources the way this pattern describes, since most people genuinely do depend on one paycheck. It's a fair concern, and the honest answer is that this pattern scales down meaningfully even without significant wealth to start with. A modest investment account generating even a small amount of dividend or interest income represents a second income source, however small, operating independently of employment. A side skill monetized inconsistently, freelance work, a small side business represents a third. The goal at a smaller scale isn't replacing a primary income immediately. It's establishing the structural habit of not depending entirely on one source, a habit that becomes increasingly valuable as each additional source grows over time. The fourth pattern involves a specific attitude toward taxes that differs from how most people approach the subject. Rather than treating tax planning as an annual reactive task handled once a year during filing season, high-net-worth households tend to treat it as an ongoing structural consideration built into decisions throughout the year. Which account a specific investment sits inside, when a specific gain gets realized, how income gets structured across different sources. This isn't about aggressive tax avoidance schemes. It's about consistently choosing the more tax-efficient version of an otherwise identical decision, whenever that choice is available. A habit that compounds meaningfully over decades, even when each individual choice seems minor in isolation. Here's where this gets genuinely interesting a second time, because the fifth pattern ties directly back to psychology rather than pure mechanics. High-net-worth households tend to measure financial progress against their own prior position rather than against other people's visible spending. This connects to something discussed extensively in research on financial behavior, the comparison trap, where spending decisions get driven by relative status among peers rather than by a household's own actual financial trajectory. Wealthy households aren't immune to social comparison entirely, but the specific habit of anchoring financial decisions to internal benchmarks. This year's savings rate compared to last year's, rather than external ones, what a neighbor or colleague appears to have, removes an enormous, ongoing source of spending pressure that has no natural stopping point. Someone might reasonably ask whether these patterns are simply easier to maintain once someone already has significant wealth, since financial discipline naturally becomes less stressful with a larger cushion. It's a fair point, and there's real truth in it. A larger financial buffer does make discipline easier to sustain. But the research on this specific question points in a particular direction worth naming directly. Many of these households report having established these exact habits before their wealth reached significant levels, not after, meaning the habits functioned as a meaningful contributor to reaching that wealth in the first place, rather than simply as a consequence of already having arrived there. By the time these 5 patterns compound together over a couple of decades, treating savings as fixed, using debt strategically rather than reactively, diversifying across multiple layers, managing taxes continuously rather than annually, and anchoring progress internally rather than externally, the cumulative effect becomes substantial, even starting from an entirely ordinary income. Someone maintaining a genuinely fixed 20% savings rate, invested consistently, and left to compound over 30 years, accumulates a meaningfully different outcome than someone earning the identical income with an inconsistent, residual savings pattern, a gap driven entirely by structure rather than by income level or access to exclusive opportunity. So if the actual question is how the 1% manages money differently, the honest answer isn't privileged access to better opportunities. It's a set of structural habits, consistently applied, that happen to compound more reliably than the reactive, inconsistent patterns most households default to without ever deciding to. The math doesn't require a specific income level to start applying these patterns, and it doesn't punish someone for starting small either. It simply rewards structure over willpower, consistency over intention, and habits built early over habits adopted only after wealth has already arrived.